All right, thank you everyone so much for coming. Why don't we get started?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is AJ Link. I am a policy analyst at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and I am being joined by Larkin. Larkin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you all for joining us. I'm Larkin Taylor Parker, the legal director at ASAN.
Thank you. We're ready for the next slide. So we're going to give a background on voting. Who can vote? Citizens 18 years of age and older can vote in federal elections if they meet state and local requirements. People 18 and older who are not US citizens can vote in state and local elections in some places, but not with others. If you are not a citizen and you are interested in voting, you should seek information carefully and talk to a lawyer, because people who vote when they are not legally allowed to vote can face criminal and immigration problems. People who have been convicted of felonies can lose voting rights. How this works varies between states. People who have felony convictions should not assume they can't vote until they have looked into it or asked a lawyer licensed in their state. Advocacy for the restoration of voting rights after felony convictions is an important equity measure. Tonight, we're talking about voting, but we also want to acknowledge that there are some things that voting can't change. Voting can't change most immediate problems. Voting can't fix most personal emergencies. Voting usually won't stop legal problems someone is already having. And voting won't feed a hungry family or fix a healthcare access problem immediately. Voting can't fix most community-wide emergencies. Voting won't prevent violence in the short term, a natural disaster. Voting won't prevent a natural disaster currently going on, and voting won't fix a recession or other economic problems currently going on. Some examples of problems voting won't solve: an eviction that has already been filed, a criminal case that is ongoing currently, an immediate job loss, food insecurity, or abortion access for someone who is currently pregnant in a state with legal barriers to access to abortion. Some community or national issues that won't be solved in the short term by voting are potentially the next mass shooting, how good the response to the current Hurricane Ian natural disaster in Florida is, and inflation. Voting also won't solve systemic cultural problems. Voting can't directly change problems the government can't directly solve. These include some forms of systemic oppression like racism or ableism, social movements that are anti-democratic, or anything else that will not be solved by passing a law or spending money. Voting can lead to political leaders who care about these issues, though. Voting can be harm reduction for some of these problems. Some of the systemic oppressions that voting cannot immediately fix are how disabled folks are disproportionately poor. Voting also can't directly fix the spread of undemocratic ideas or people's choices to try to impose their moral and religious beliefs on others who do not share them. Some other tactics to consider include mutual aid, litigation, learning and teaching others, pressure advocacy, civil disobedience, contacting lawmakers, and ideas of your own. Voting isn't enough to solve society's problems. Voting is a tool with certain uses. There are other tools available to fix problems voting can't address. It's important to use the right tool for the right job.
Why vote? We've talked about some of the problems voting can't solve and some of the things we can't accomplish with it. So let's talk now about some of the things we can and some of the reasons voting is worthwhile for people who are able to do it. There are some benefits of voting. These include more responsive leaders, leaders who may be more willing to listen to us, more representative leaders, harm reduction, as AJ described, through electing leaders who care about equity and support marginalized people. Showing political power also makes elected officials more interested in our concerns. If it's clear that people in the disability community vote, disability issues are more interesting to elected leaders. Electing leaders who care about democracy, civil rights, and the rule of law helps us continue to have those things. There are a lot of parts of our democracy and peaceful transitions of power between different elected officials that count on a certain amount of respect for the system and willingness to go along with the rules and accept the results of a free and fair election. If we don't have leaders who value democracy, who will play by those rules, who will take power when they've won and step down and move on gracefully when they've lost an election, we're going to have a hard time continuing to have democracy and the civil rights that a lot of people have worked very hard and sacrificed a lot up to and including their lives to give us today, and the rule of law that helps keep those hard-won rights secure. Sometimes voting even provides some direct opportunities to help make policy. A lot of times this is at a state or local level. Next slide, please. A lot of people who are eligible to vote will choose to do so in presidential election years, but voting in the midterms is important too. A lot that is very important is decided in the midterms. A lot of congressional races happen in midterm years, as do races for seats in state legislatures, which is like Congress for a particular state. Members of Congress and state legislators decide what laws are made and also how money is spent. And this is very important. Laws matter for what civil and human rights are and aren't protected, and what is considered a crime. Spending matters for anything that costs money, like HCBS, housing policy, education, and what medical research is funded. And this is an important thing to keep an eye on this year, because we're in a midterm year. The midterms are the elections halfway through a presidential term. It's usually what people are talking about when they bring up the midterms, and we are in a midterm year. Next slide, please. So here are some more details about voting and what it can accomplish, in different ways. Next slide, please. It's important to know what's on the ballot. And the answer to this question depends on the year. And it depends on location. On a ballot, there may be candidates for federal office, like someone running for president in presidential election years, or a member of Congress who might be running in a midterm year as well. There are candidates for state offices, like state legislators and governors. And there are also candidates for local offices running in many areas. The specific makeup varies from place to place, but in a given election, there's usually a mix of these things. There may be other items on a ballot too. This can include referenda, bonds, and in some states, amendments to state constitutions. Referendas are about putting a question directly to the electorate. This is one area where voting may be a chance to help make policy directly. Because in these votes, the electorate gets to decide on a policy provision in the way the state legislature usually does and actually vote on a policy. Bonds tend to be local, and they're about whether a governmental entity can borrow money to spend it, can spend on infrastructure projects, usually at a town or county level. And again, some amendments to state constitutions have to go on the ballot in an election. And that also provides significant opportunities to make policy decisions for ordinary people to go out and vote and make policy decisions directly. Next slide, please. Let's talk more about races for local office. Races for local office are very important for local issues. These have a fast, significant impact on ordinary people's lives. Local offices matter for what books children can read in school, whether the local DA uses the death penalty, who is appointed a guardian, and what the policies and rules are around local policing. The impact of these races is geographically small. It's very local, and it will not necessarily have impact beyond the local community. But the effect in that local community will be very significant. These races are often neglected, with little media coverage of what candidates support, and low turnout on less important federal or state races that are getting more media coverage are also going on. These rarely get much media coverage outside of big cities. Because turnout tends to be so low in races for local office, a few voters deciding to turn out and vote can make a very big difference in the outcome. Next slide, please. Here are some local offices. The specific ones that people may be voting for vary from place to place because different parts of the country have different kinds of local officers. But here are some common ones: district attorneys, police chiefs, mayors, city council members, county commissioners, school board members, and sometimes judges or other court officials. Those are all offices that have an impact on things like what local law is, who goes to jail, who doesn't go to jail, and what public education is like. Next slide, please. Races for state office are important too. The impact may not be as fast and abrupt and noticeable as something local, like a change in who the district attorney is, which can have big policy effects on what crimes are prosecuted. But the outcome of these races affects the whole state. These offices include governors who make decisions about how to enforce the law and what happens in state agencies, legislators who make decisions about how states spend money and what the law says, and higher court judges in many states who may be making statewide decisions or decisions covering a region of a state about what the law means, and maybe making important legal decisions that affect a lot of people's lives. This is probably the level where the impact on ordinary people is the most significant over time, because the state level is where a lot of criminal law is made. It's where decisions are made about licensing for jobs, what jobs require a license. A lot of family law and guardianship law, adult guardianship law happens at this level. And this affects all kinds of important civil rights issues like mass incarceration, reproductive justice, and educational access. This will become much more important in the years to come. Under our current Supreme Court, more of these decisions are going to get made at a state level. So who is in these positions will matter a great deal. There's often more media coverage of these races than local ones, and better turnout. But these still often have lower turnout than federal races, which gives relatively small numbers of voters a chance to make a difference. Next slide. Then we have federal races. Presidents cover foreign policy, who runs federal agencies and what they do, nominations for federal judge positions, and executive orders. Members of Congress make federal law and decide how money is spent, and many of them are up for re-election this year. They also decide whether presidential nominations get confirmed. Lawmaking by Congress or an executive order by the president can have a pretty fast effect depending on how they decide to write it. Spending and appointments, especially to the federal judiciary, where people tend to stay in their jobs for a very long time, have slower effects, but as those effects spread out across society, they're very big and powerful. Next slide, please. We talked a little bit about these other ballot items. Some states, towns, and counties do use things like referenda and bond votes to make policy about what local law will say or what infrastructure projects will and won't get built. Some states have to put amendments on the ballot when they're trying to change their constitutions. And these are important opportunities to help make decisions about public policy directly. Sometimes these questions are worded in confusing ways, so it can be especially important to do research and to understand the issues. Next slide, please. Do we have any questions?
From the chat, how can I learn about who to vote for in local elections?
Sometimes there's local news coverage that talks about who candidates are and what they believe in. Other times, this requires a little more legwork. Nonprofits will sometimes put out voter guides, and candidates increasingly can have pretty active social media presences sometimes, where there are ways to go online and find out what they think and what they want to do directly from them. In really small communities, a lot of people learn about this by word of mouth because they may know candidates personally and have their own opinions about the people who are running. AJ, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that you can go to your local county office or your local city office or even a local library, and they'll have information, or they should have information, where you can also look up your district or candidates online.
You can also call them or go to town halls. And I'm also going to put a link in the chat to some of our voting resources, which aren't going to tell you how to vote, but there is a resource there called Ballotopedia that can help you see who's running in your local offices for your area.
This is one of those things where the specific place where a voter lives matters a lot, because sometimes who is on the ballot for a city council slot or something like that comes down to being on one side of a municipal or district line versus the other.
Another question from the chat. What are the most important issues facing the autistic community in the midterms?
That's a good question. I think they're similar to the issues facing society on the whole. There are competing visions right now on issues of civil rights and bodily autonomy, and what the country will look like in the years to come. And those have great significance for the autistic community. Those will affect autistic people in numerous ways. Other issues that are significant to our community include things like home and community-based services, and issues affecting the employment and education opportunities that may be available to us, as well as issues affecting access and any possibility of improving the accessibility of society on the whole. AJ, do you have anything to add?
No.
And next slide, please. We have another webinar coming up on October 20th at 6 p.m. Eastern. I think HA will be presenting that one along with our colleague, Greg. We really hope you'll join us for that one. AJ Link and Greg Robinson will put on a great event, and we'll talk with you some more about the specifics of how to exercise the right to vote and how to combat voting barriers for you and your community.
Thank you everyone so much for coming. We're going to wrap up and have a great day.